Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. Today's topic is an interesting one, because I'll be discussing how you can incorporate stories you didn't write yourself into your setting and the stories you do write. And I'm not talking about plagiarism and how much or how little you can get away with. I'm talking about old stories, myths and fairy tales and public domain stories that have become part of our cultural heritage. You can copy stories like these beat for beat without getting into any legal trouble. But you shouldn't, because of reasons I'll get into later. First, however, let me give you a few reasons why you should consider using old stories for your setting. No story is truly original. Something that a lot of aspiring authors, and more than a few of the professionals, have trouble wrapping their heads around, is that there are no stories that are truly original. All stories have their source in something that already exists, whether that be older stories, things that happen to real people, emotional states, landscapes, or even a crazy dream. Good authors can pull from all of these various sources and create something that feels unique and interesting, even though every component has a source that you can cite. Let's use Avatar: The Last Airbender as an example. Taken together, the world and story of Avatar are unlike anything else in American children's animation that was out at the time. But once you start picking apart the components, you can see the sources that it drew from. The concept of 4 elements goes back at least as far as ancient Greece, and just as an example, the show The Planeteers portrays characters who can manipulate each element independently. A lot of story elements in Avatar that seem unique in Western media have been in Chinese and Japanese films and stories for decades or longer, such as the blind bastard who can see without sight, the drawn-out confrontation between the young protagonist and an old master, and the use of martial arts moves to manipulate the energy of the world around you. Even the combination animals are part of a concept that goes back to ancient times. And back in the 80s, there was a cartoon show called The Wuzzles that was specifically about combination creatures. Cliche stories aren't always bad. The reason I told you that was to tell you this. You shouldn't worry so much about using old stories, formulas, or cliches. If your story is predictable, that doesn't mean it's bad. And if your story is unpredictable, that often means it doesn't make any sense. And that is definitely bad. Consider this. There are stories that we read or watched when we were growing up, and we watched them again and again and again. Our enjoyment did not come from wondering what would happen next because we knew what would happen next. We were waiting for it, anticipating it, and we loved reliving the moment something great happened, even if we could quote every word of it from memory. That's all the evidence you need to understand why cliches can be good things. What is bad is creating a story that contains nothing new. When you retell an old story or use an old formula, you should ask yourself what it is that you're bringing to the story that you haven't seen before. What's different about your version? Why should people consume your version instead of the version that inspired you? What is it that you are adding to the story that you haven't seen in any other version? You don't have to provide concrete answers to these questions, but you should at least feel confident that you could answer them if you needed to. Build new bodies on old skeletons. One good way to bring something new to an old story is to start with the basic outline of the old story and build on it by bringing in new parts from other sources. The Witcher short stories that started the franchise began with grim and Polish folktales and built on them by placing them in a dark fantasy setting and having a professional monster hunter interact with the characters. Ella Enchanted, the novel version anyway, is a retelling of the Cinderella story that adds so much around the core story that you could barely recognize what it is until the slipper falls off. The Firebird by Mercedes Lackey, a personal favorite of mine, starts with the ballet version of the story and then builds a world around it that features a variety of other Russian folk tales and spirits. A story formula like a hero's journey or the whodunit investigation is extremely flexible. All these formulas have some very specific points to tick off one by one. The nature of these points, the context, and the order you tick them off can be adjusted however you like. For that matter, you can skip a few points, or add some of your own. For instance, the TV show Columbo is a murder mystery that shows you the murderer committing the act first. And because of this rearrangement of an old formula, the story becomes less about tracking down clues and stumbling across red herrings, and more about a cat-and-mouse game between the detective and the murderer. Incorporate old myths. Mythology is a great resource to draw on when you're creating speculative stories or a whole setting. And I don't just mean the classic mythic wells like Greek and Norse mythology. Every culture in the world has a set of mythological creatures, gods, and heroic figures that you can adapt into a setting or a story. What's really nice about these myths is that they tend to be very short and modular, which means you'll have plenty of extra room you can use to expand the story and add in your own ideas. Pretty much every Disney movie based on a fairy tale is an example of this. They tell the main story straight, but then they add in extra stuff like animal sidekicks, bumbling fairies, and evil suitors. Many fantasy settings include creatures lifted straight out of mythology, like unicorns, dragons, vampires, and trolls. And since none of these creatures actually exist, authors are free to lift a few identifying features from the legends and then customize the details into whatever they want. And don't think that only fantasy settings can make use of myths and legends. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou was a historical fiction film set in the Deep South in 1937, which borrows a lot of its plot points and imagery from Homer's Odyssey. You could also use a science fiction setting to tell, let's say, Theseus's battles with bandits when he was traveling to Athens. Just have each of the bandits be a different kind of alien and have them threaten Theseus with futuristic technology. You could also have futuristic technology recreate mythological creatures like chimeras or vampires or dragons. Or maybe ancient gods turn out to be extremely powerful aliens who left Earth long ago. Once you realize that you can separate the myths from the cultures that created them, you can get some very interesting results when you start to mix and match. Retell modern classics. Old myths aren't the only stories worth repeating. Whenever a new work explodes with popularity, there are always dozens of imitators who show up and try and capture some of their thunder. Think about all the science fiction and fantasy blockbusters that came out after Star Wars, all the wizard urban fantasy movies that followed Harry Potter, and all of the vampire romance novels that followed the Twilight Saga. Now, I will admit, most of these followers are just cash grabs by people who are trying to ride a fad before it crashes back to the ground. But if you feel inspired by something popular and you want to create your own version of the same story, then do it. Oftentimes, the followers can become just as famous as the originals. The movie Alien was 20th Century Fox's attempt to cash in on the Star Wars craze, and it turned into a whole franchise. So if you read a story or watch a film and you feel inspired to tell your own version of that story with your own spin on that formula, go for it. If you really want to make it your own and don't just change a couple of details here and there, then your audience will know that you're not just trying to write a fad. Mythology as setting background. Now, let's get into how this topic can affect your setting. What if all the Greek myths were true? What if they all really happened, but the setting takes place in the present day? What if fairy tales are like blueprints, and they all keep happening over and over again because magic forces people into following the formulas? What if all the gods are real, and they battle each other to earn the worship of mortals? Adding mythological creatures and gods and heroes is an easy enough concept to grasp. Tolkien did it by adding elves and dwarves and wizards to Middle-earth, and Dungeons & Dragons is packed to the brim with mythological monsters taken from all over the world. Kobolds from Germany, trolls from Norse myths, Jinn from Arabia, Rakshasas from India, and Oni from Japan. So why not also assume that the stories that involve these creatures also happen at some point in the history of your setting? Maybe Aladdin had his adventure with the sorcerer and the genie's lamp 200 years ago, and now the lamp has fallen into the hands of a new protagonist. Maybe there's a Norse giant who remembers battling with Thor in the good old days, but now they settle their differences on the racquetball court. By including the stories, you don't get to customize your mythical figures quite as much as you could otherwise, but in exchange, you give your setting some extra depth, and you give yourself an opportunity to compare then versus now. Going beyond the ever after. Instead of retelling the old stories or having them take place in the distant past, what if they had only just happened? What if we assumed that the protagonists don't live happily ever after, and instead something interesting happens either to them or to a new set of protagonists, like their kids, or the former enemies who turn out to be just misunderstood? A lot of works have explored that sort of idea in recent years. Disney's Aladdin has 2 sequel movies and a TV series set after the original story ended. The novel Wicked retells the Wizard of Oz from the Wicked Witch of the West's perspective, and creates a whole new context for the events. The Lord of the Rings trilogy is an example of this, since originally The Hobbit was a standalone novel based on Norse and Anglo-Saxon myths, and only afterwards did Tolkien decide to incorporate it into his big fantasy setting and reuse a lot of the old characters to tell a bigger story. Your setting and your stories are not going to be completely original, so don't waste your effort on trying to be unexpected, and instead embrace the old stories and myths and use them to tell the kinds of stories you want to tell. If they've survived this long, there's usually a reason why, and so it can often be a big help to use their skeletons to build your own settings and stories. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into weaving worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.